Hey everybody. Today I'm reading The Politics of Backwardness, the Revolution of 1905, which is Chapter 2 of the Social and Political Thought of Leon Trotsky by Baruch Knei-Paz. The sections are social classes and political movements, and the subheadings within that section are the bourgeoisie and liberalism, the peasantry and agrarian reform, the proletariat and social democracy. The next section is the emerging pattern of Russian politics. So let's go. Get that bee. There's a lot of bees flying around. I wonder if you can hear that. Anyway, the politics of backwardness, the revolution of 1905. Quote, in Russian life, the revolution of 1905 was the dress rehearsal for the revolution of 1917, end quote. Trotsky. On the eve of what came to be known as the Revolution of 1905, Russia was a vast empire, part in Europe, part in Asia, with a population of nearly 150 million, of whom some 80% were peasants, and the total composed of more than 20 nationalities. Footnote. For a brief summary of demographic figures for Russia from 1897 to 1914, see J.N. Westwood, Endurance and Endeavor, Russian History, 1812 to 1971. End footnote. I forget where I was. Some 80% were peasants, and the total composed of more than 20 nationalities. With an economic system, part of which had been industrialized, the greater part of which, however, continued to be based on largely primitive agricultural production. A social structure and a cultural tradition remarkable for their combination of both backward and modern features, and the whole held together by a centralized absolutist autocracy at the head of which stood a somewhat pathetic, quote, father figure, end quote, oblivious to the contradictions and ferment around him, waging war with Japan and everywhere pursuing, quote, big power, end quote, pretensions. In 1905, this enormous edifice was on the verge of collapse. Such a calamity had long been predicted by the numerous revolutionary and non-revolutionary groups active in Russia, but as it unfolded during the months of 1905, it revealed features both unique and unforeseen. Footnote. For a general account of the revolution, see Sidney Harcave, The Russian Revolution of 1905, published in 1970. For an account of Russian social democracy, especially the formation of its ideas during the revolution, see Schwartz. End footnote. Although the Revolution of 1905 was to enter history as a failed bourgeois revolution, its main impetus was not provided by the middle classes, nor did the peasantry, an uncertain but potentially explosive force, stand at the center of the widespread disturbances of that famous year. Instead, the most active, certainly the most precipitant social force proved to be the still nascent working class. It is true, of course, that during 1905 there were numerous peasant revolts, and that the liberal bourgeoisie had clearly decided to lay claim to a substantial share of political power. Yet the latter, far from initiating the attack upon the autocracy, was simply swept into the general mood by events not of its own making. As for the peasantry, it rebelled in the only way it knew how, spontaneously, sporadically, without organization or leadership, and with only the vaguest notion of its goals. Neither of these social groups, whether independent or even together, posed an insurmountable threat to the autocracy. To an unprecedented extent, their effectiveness was dependent on that of a third group, the workers, who, although on their own would have been similarly impotent, in conjunction with the others constituted the most decisive factor in undermining the regime's powers of resistance. It was the workers who had opened the whole drama with their St. Petersburg procession on the 9th/22nd of January. It was they who throughout the year threatened to paralyze the whole economy with general strikes in the major urban centers, and it was they who, as the events came to a head, issued the most radical demands. It was the workers who, albeit briefly and to a limited extent, grasped at actual political power. In the middle of October, they established the St. Petersburg Soviet of Workers' Deputies, which in St. Petersburg, for a few weeks, exercised independent authority. The disproportionate importance of the Russian working class had been noticed by many prior to the events of 1905, but not even the most optimistic amongst them had quite foreseen the scope and intensity which characterized the workers' involvement in the revolution. Lenin had indeed predicted that the proletariat would be the vanguard of a temporary alliance with the bourgeoisie, and others too had spoken in not dissimilar terms. Footnote, see Schwartz, for a discussion of Menshevik and Bolshevik views before 1905. End footnote. Yet what happened in 1905 went beyond what even they had presumed, for it raised, for the first time, however tentatively, the possibility of a workers' seizure of power. This was surely incompatible with that of the Russian Marxists, what the Russian Marxists had in general anticipated, namely a, quote, bourgeois revolution, end quote, at best. But if, as everyone so matter-of-factly expected, the revolution in Russia was to usher in a period of, quote, bourgeois democracy, end quote, who and where were those social factors, more specifically, that social class, which could translate this expectation into political reality? The weakness of the, quote, orthodox Russian Marxist position was that it itself subscribed to a view of the Russian bourgeoisie which argued against the very prediction which it so confidently awaited to be fulfilled. For if the bourgeoisie, as all Marxists agreed, was weak, cowardly, dependent on the good graces of the state, and economically impotent, how could it be expected to stand at the head of a revolution? Surely such was not the condition of the European bourgeoisie on the eve of its political triumph. By the middle of 1905, the fundamental contradiction in the Marxist tradition was something which Lenin, for example, could no longer ignore. It was then, primarily in the work The Two Tactics of Social Democracy and the Democratic Revolution, that Lenin finally despaired of bourgeois revolutionism and called for alliance between workers and peasants against the state and against the bourgeoisie itself. Footnote. There's two footnotes here, actually. On the early history and ideas of the Russian social democratic movement, see also the following: Leopold Haemsen, The Russian Marxists and the Origins of Bolshevism, published in 1955, J.L.H. Keep, The Rise of Social Democracy in Russia, Richard Pipes, Social Democracy in the St. Petersburg Labor Movement, 1885 to 1897, Donald W. Treadgold, Lenin and His Rivals, The Struggle for Russia's Future, 1898 to 1906, Alan K. Wildman, The Making of a Workers' Revolution, Russian Social Democracy, 1891 to 1903. The most complete account of Lenin's ideas before and after 1905 is Alfred G. Mayer's Leninism, published in 1962. See also Adam B. Ulam, The Bolsheviks, in 1968. On Plekhanov, see Samuel H. Baron, Plekhanov, The Father of Russian Marxism. For an account of Bolshevism by a former Menshevik leader, see Theodor Don, The Origins of Bolshevism, 1964. On the ideas of the legal Marxists, see Richard Kindersley, The First Russian Revisionists, 1962. This is not, of course, exhaustive literature on these subjects, but other works will be referred to in the course of this study. End footnote. But as the title of this work, The Two Tactics of Social Democracy and the Democratic Revolution, indicates, Lenin continued to view the future within a traditional framework. The new alliance was a tactical alternative. As for the aim, a democratic bourgeois republic, it remained unaffected. Moreover, if Lenin had resolved one contradiction, he had introduced another, more serious one. How could two classes, the peasantry and the proletariat, make the revolution of a third, the bourgeoisie, particularly when the spearhead of this alliance, the workers, were said to be implacable enemies of the capitalist system? In due course, on the eve of his triumph over some 12 years later, Lenin would belatedly, and perhaps opportunistically, recognize and jettison this contradiction as well. But in the meantime, not even he, much less the Mensheviks whose position at one point wavered, but in the end altered not at all, was prepared to repudiate what seemed the holiest of Marxist cows. Footnote: see Schwartz, pages 10 to 16 for the temporary influence on some Mensheviks of Parvis and Trotsky. Through the newspaper Chalo, which the two were editing in 1905. End footnote. In a sense, it may be said that such a repudiation was precisely what Trotsky in 1905 and thereafter resolved to make. As we have seen, the only Russian social democrat to draw more far-reaching conclusions, already at the outset of 1905, had been Parvis, and the first to become immediately a convert to these conclusions was his younger quote, disciple, end quote, Trotsky. By the time he returned to Russia in October 1905, Trotsky was already convinced that he would be a witness to an event unlike anything imagined by his quote, orthodox, end quote, colleagues. Trotsky's actual experience of the revolution of 1905 confirmed for Trotsky the hypotheses which he and Parvis had speculated upon during their discussions in Munich. Footnote: for an account of Trotsky's role in 1905, see Deutscher the Prophet Armed, Chapter 5. Trotsky's own account is in My Life, Chapter 14. End footnote. Back to the text. Trotsky's actual experience of the revolution of 1905 confirmed for him the hypotheses which he and Parvis had speculated upon during their discussions in Munich. The most daring of these hypotheses was that Russia was on the brink of a seizure of power by the workers, not the bourgeoisie. That in fact, the bourgeoisie was impossible. The latter was impossible in the context of Russian history and society. That whether in 1905 or later, whenever it finally came, the upheaval in Russia would culminate with a workers' government in power. But while Parvis was the first to contemplate this prospect, it was Trotsky who was to give it the framework of a full theoretical construction. To this end, Trotsky attempted to do two main things. Firstly, to describe and appraise the behavior of social classes and their political movements as this emerged in 1905. The point of this would be to see in such behavior a reflection in the mirror of Russian society. Secondly, and consequently, to re-examine Russia's social history with a view to arriving at a sociology of classes, of economics, and finally, of revolutionary politics. Although obviously Trotsky did not subdivide his writings in accordance with these two aims, but rather dealt with them jointly, in what follows we shall separate them in order to better clarify the issues involved in the manner of Trotsky's argumentation. Footnote: the separation is thematic, not schematic, and thus in keeping with Trotsky's own conception of these subjects. End footnote. The present chapter, therefore, will deal with Trotsky's analysis of the politics of 1905. The next chapter will consider his sociology of Russian society, and the chapter after that will discuss the culmination, so to speak, of Trotsky's investigations, namely the theory of the permanent revolution. Section 1. Social classes and political movements. A. New section. The bourgeoisie and liberalism. Trotsky's analysis of the Russian bourgeoisie and of Russian liberalism may be seen as an attempt to carry the generally accepted argument about the feebleness of the Russian middle classes to its logical conclusion. If the bourgeoisie was indeed so impotent a force, if it resembled its Western counterparts only in name, then it was incumbent in his view to draw practical political conclusions which would take account of this anomaly. Not to do so meant to deny the relevance of social history to political events, and this is precisely what he accused his Marxist colleagues of doing. That is, misunderstanding and ignoring the political reality which was taking shape around them, thereby also remaining fixed within theoretical preconceptions which did not conform to that reality. In the next chapter, we shall consider in detail Trotsky's contention that capitalism as such had not taken root in Russia, in spite of the change of the 2 decades or so preceding 1905. As a point of departure for our present purposes, we shall only note here that, in Trotsky's view, what passed for capitalism in Russia consisted of two artificial components: foreign capital and a handful of local entrepreneurs growing rich as a result of the industrial boom. But the former, he believed, was not only a non-indigenous factor, it was also, in the form of European financiers, an ally of the autocracy. As for the latter, it was not only limited in numbers, it was also without indigenous social roots, and dependent on the state. Neither could possibly be interested in any radical transformation, much less the downfall of the autocracy. Both were doing very well out of Tsarism. While the formal structure of capitalism may have been thus incorporated through the exigencies of financing industry, the, quote, infrastructure, end quote, was completely missing. For Trotsky grasped capitalism as a social and cultural system, and not merely an economic arrangement. A big capitalist class, quote, grafted onto, end quote, an economic policy, was not the equivalent of a bourgeois social class. The backbone of revolution is not the industrial baron, but the self-made middle classes who in the course of a long period succeed in penetrating the social organism, and whose existence in fact transforms social life. Not merely industrialization, but an urban life having certain identifiable cultural attributes, characterizes a bourgeois capitalist society. The absence of such components, a direct result of the peculiar development of Russia, was in Trotsky's view responsible for the weakness of the bourgeois liberal movement. It was without social foundations, itself an alien tissue, quote, grafted onto, end quote, a hostile body which could not but reject it. Footnote. Sources for Trotsky's views on Russian capitalism will be given in Chapter 3 below, but for a succinct summary of his position, see his book 1905. This is one of Trotsky's most important works and will be frequently referred to in the course of this study. Trotsky's book 1905 consists of essays and articles written during the period 1905 to 8, and first published in Germany under the title Russland in der Revolution in Dresden in 1910. The first Russian edition, containing some additions in the form of appendices, was published in Moscow in January 1922. The second and consequent Russian editions are identical to the first except for one further appendix, based on articles written in 1922. See Chapter 3, Note 48, and some minor additions to an article which previously appeared incomplete. All references are to the fourth Russian edition. For the English translation, see Trotsky 1905, published in 1972. End footnote. And, in fact, as one looks at the character of the Russian liberal movement as it began to take political shape at the outset of the 20th century, it is this element of rootlessness which is most striking. Paul Milyukov, himself one of its leaders, defined Russian liberalism as, quote, not bourgeois but intellectual, end quote. And Max Weber once characterized Russian liberalism as, quote, the bearer of a political and socio-political idealism, end quote, Max Weber, which, however, was isolated from industrial and financial forces. All dogs are nuts. Footnote, quoted in Kohan, Russia in Revolution. For a history of Russian liberalism, see George Fisher, Russian Liberalism from Gentry to Intelligentsia. End footnote. It consisted of two primary groupings, the gentry and the intelligentsia. The gentry in this connection meaning mainly members of the free professions. the intelligentsia in this connection meaning mainly members of the free professions. The gentry, as a part of the nobility, was, of course, directly tied to the traditional social hierarchy, but distinguished as it was from the older and original aristocracy by more limited landholdings and more local administrative functions, it soon developed a cohesion of its own. Footnote. This distinction between, quote, gentry and, quote, aristocracy is the one made by Fisher. George Fisher. End footnote. The basis for the cohesion became institutionalized from 1864 onward with the establishment of the form of local self-government known as the Zemstvo, or territorial assembly. Zemstvo. A Zemstvo was an institution of local government set up during the Great Emancipation Reform of 1861, carried out in Imperial Russia by Emperor Alexander II of Russia. Nikolai Milutin elaborated the idea of the Zemstva, and the first Zemstvo laws went into effect in 1864. After the October Revolution, the Zemstvo system was shut down by the Bolsheviks and replaced with a multi-level system of workers' and peasants' councils, quote, Soviets. And just before Pavel Milyukov was mentioned earlier, Pavel Milyukov lived from 1859 to 1943 and was a Russian historian and liberal politician. Milyukov was the founder, leader, and the most prominent member of the Constitutional Democratic Party known as the Cadets. He changed his view on the monarchy between 1905 and 1917. In the Russian Provisional Government, he served as foreign minister, working to prevent Russia's exit from the First World War. Back to the text. Although delegates to these assemblies, the Zemstvo, could be elected from amongst non-noble landowners and even peasants, the gentry in fact always dominated the institution. From this grew its struggle with the autocracy, first for local autonomy and, later, for a share in the central government as well. But the gentry, aside from the fact that it for the most part leaned towards some kind of accommodation with the autocracy, and culturally remained rooted in the land, did not succeed in transforming its liberal ideas into a movement. There was a Zemstvo movement focused on rural government reforms, but no liberal movement as such. Only at the very beginning of the 20th century did organized liberalism come into being, and then it was no longer the gentry that stood at its head, but rather the intelligentsia, or professional middle class. The latter at first in the employ of the Zemstvos, as doctors, teachers, veterinarians, statisticians, the quote, the third element, end quote, as they came to be called, soon began to exert political and ideological influence on their own, and joined hands with the upper intelligentsia, lawyers, academics, high government officials, who were to be found outside the Zemstvos. Thus, when in 1902 a liberal journal, Osvobozdenie, Liberation, began to appear, and a year later a liberal organization, Zuyaz Osvobozdenia, Union of Liberation, was established. It was not members of the gentry who were its main leaders, but men like Struve and Milyukov, representatives of the intelligentsia. The effect of this, initially at least, was on the one hand to push Russian liberalism leftward into closer ties with the revolutionary groups and into more far-reaching political demands. On the other hand, however, the shift from gentry to intelligentsia accentuated the movement's social isolation. It now became the enclave of professional men with hardly any influence on the court and without any place in the economic structure of the country, not even as representatives of economic interests. This fact really merely re-emphasizes the difference between Russian liberalism and Russian liberalism's Western counterpart. The latter was rooted in a business middle class and became the ideology of a completely transformed industrial urban society. Russian liberalism, at first linked to a segment of the rural traditional milieu, remained suspended in the air, a refuge for disenchanted members of the professional middle class, the quote, bearers of a quote, idealism, end quote, far removed from the predominant Russian reality. Is this phenomenon of a movement, more specifically a social class, in search of social roots, on the whole without success, and thus characterized by vacillation, uncertainty, and lack of confidence in the sphere of political action, which forms the basis for Trotsky's critique of Russian liberalism, a critique made in the brochure Do Go Yan Varya until the 9th of January, written at the end of 1904, and which had so impressed Parvis, and followed by numerous other broadsides both during and after the events of 1905. Footnote. Most of his important articles on Russian liberalism, as well as Do Go Yan Varya, were collected by Trotsky in his Nasha Revolutionitsia, I don't know if I'm saying any of that right, published in St. Petersburg in 1906, and subsequent references to them are as they appear in this edition. These articles, together with other writings on the same subject, may also be found in Trotsky's Zachinnyania. End footnote. These writings are often polemical in nature, sometimes no more than scathing diatribes against a political opponent with few pretensions to analytical detachment, but leaving aside the purely polemical thrusts, they acutely expose what Trotsky saw as the liberals' main weakness, the liberals' inability to stand at the head of a mass movement, the liberals' fundamentally compromissory, even appeasing attitude toward the monarchy, and the liberals' fear of unleashing a revolutionary mood over which the liberals would have no control, since, as the liberals not incorrectly presumed, it would be directed as much against them as against the autocracy. Until the 9th of January, the peace by Trotsky was occasioned by the heightened opposition campaign of the Zemstvos, or the Zemstvos, which culminated in November 1904 with a convention and resolution calling on the Tsar to revise the system of government and broaden the basis of popular representation. The first part of the brochure was devoted to showing how meek, in fact, and half-hearted the demands of the liberal gentry were. Footnote. The support which the Zemstvos had given to the war with Japan, Trotsky noted at the outset, exposed their inability to free themselves of a chauvinism which, in Trotsky's view, was fundamentally no different from that of the most reactionary elements. End footnote. No, get out of here, man. Skedat. Fucking bee flying at me. They were, in Trotsky's view, not so much demands as requests. Instead of speaking in the clear language of ultimatums, the Zemstvo leaders were appealing to the good sense of the Tsar, pleading with the Tsar to, quote, join, end quote, them in bringing about reforms. The notion that the Tsar should be, quote, forced, end quote, to accede to changes had not crossed their minds. They could not imagine a social framework without the autocracy. This was not so much a consequence of the liberals' anti-revolutionism, although it was that as well, as of their fundamental desire for an accommodation with a slightly reformed status quo. Thus they shied away from explosive terms, refusing to, quote, call things by their right names, a constitution, a republic, universal suffrage, end quote. Quote, the Russian liberals, in general and the Zemstvo liberalism in particular have never attempted to break with the monarchy and are not attempting to break with the monarchy now. On the contrary, the Russian liberals in general and the Zemstvo liberalism in particular have been trying to convince the monarchy that the way to saving the monarchy's self lies in the acceptance of the principles of liberalism. End quote. Trotsky. Hence their failure to repudiate the monarchical principle, hence their restrained tactics which revealed the, quote, whole soul of our privileged opposition, end quote. Quote, compromise instead of struggle, rapprochement at all costs, hence the drive to facilitate for absolutism the mental drama of such rapprochement, to organize itself not for the purpose of a struggle against the autocracy, but for the purpose of making itself useful to it, not to defeat the government, but to lure the government to its side, to be worthy of its gratitude and trust, ... End quote. Trotsky. If anything, Trotsky's criticism of the liberal intelligentsia was even more scathing than his criticism of the gentry. For in the intelligentsia's vacillating attitude toward the idea of revolution, Trotsky saw not only the betrayal of those very principles which it so passionately proclaimed, but the final bankruptcy of Russian liberalism as a movement capable of transforming the political and social structure of Russia. What those liberals had failed to grasp, according to Trotsky, was that a bourgeois democratic revolution was neither bourgeois nor democratic nor a revolution unless the bourgeoisie itself acted in a revolutionary manner. Quote, democracy, turning its back on revolution or nourishing illusions of a peaceful renovation of Russia, is undermining its own strength, its own future. Such a democracy is an inner contradiction. An anti-revolutionary democracy is no democracy at all. End quote. Trotsky. Here, in Trotsky's view, was the fatal flaw in Russian liberalism. Lacking a mass movement, it was unable to gather enough momentum for a revolutionary assault on the autocracy. But anything short of a revolutionary assault could only end in the kind of compromise in which the monarchy would always have the upper hand. Thus the intelligentsia's demand for universal suffrage, for a constitution, for a national assembly, demands which in Russia were revolutionary in themselves, lacked the credibility which could only be generated by a movement with a mass base. This is why the autocracy could formally subscribe to certain liberal demands and in practice with impunity ignore them. The extent to which the intelligentsia recoiled from revolutionary change Trotsky perceived in its attitude toward the very masses who are now becoming active in politics. For these masses, peasants and workers, were not the masses of liberal reforms but of social changes which liberalism was not even prepared to contemplate. Thus, while seeking some common front with peasants and workers for lack of a mass base of its own, liberalism simultaneously renounced a genuine alliance. More radical than the Zemstvo gentry, the intelligentsia was yet less radical, in Trotsky's view, than the most conscious element of the masses, the workers. Thus it pleaded for de-radicalization as the basis for a common front. Quote, ... shorn of its disguise, the liberals' demands, to the proletariat, amount to this, quote, remove yourselves, rid your revolutionary program and your revolutionary tactics of all that which distinguishes you from us. Abandon those demands which are not acceptable to the Moscow trader and the Tambov nobleman. In a word, betray those principles which you have proclaimed, ... End quote. Trotsky. Trotsky completed the writing of Until the 9th of January in December 1904, but it was not published until the following March. Footnote. The delay in publication explains its title, end footnote. By then, of course, Russia was in the midst of an upheaval with all segments of society participating in the assault on the autocracy. There is no question but that the liberals, in the course of a few months, had not only intensified but radicalized their demands. Trotsky acknowledged this openly. In his post-January 1905 articles, he paid tribute to this move leftwards, somewhat revising his earlier analysis. Footnote. See, for instance, the article, Capital versus Opposition, and I don't know, that's something in Russian. I don't fucking know. Moreover, Trotsky also acknowledged that the liberal intelligentsia had been strengthened by the entry of the capitalist bourgeoisie into the political arena and its identification with the liberal demands. But all this, in his view, had not changed the essential alignment of political forces, for the shift leftwards had been universal and not limited to the liberals. In fact, the liberals, both gentry and intelligentsia, as well as industrial interests, had upped their demands primarily as a result of the, quote, external pressure of revolutionary democratic forces, end quote. They had, so to speak, been swept along on the wave of the mass ferment, becoming not so much intrinsically bolder as being compelled by events not of their own making to strike a pose more attuned to the mood of the country. In the case of, quote, commercial industrial capital, end quote, an element of economic self-interest was at work. A constitutional state was certainly not incompatible with the development of an internal market, but here too Trotsky believed the primary motive was to keep as much in step with the times as possible. By doing so, the liberal movement hoped both to stem or at least appease the masses and somehow to remain at the head of the opposition to the government, thus preventing a flood which would sweep them aside. Quote, the liberals of the left wing will, at first, follow the people. The liberals of the left wing will soon attempt to take the people into their own hands. The people are a power. One must master the people. But the people are, too, a revolutionary power. A revolutionary power, one must tame the people. These are evidently the future tactics of the Osvobozhdeny group, end quote. Trotsky. But here again Trotsky believed the liberal flaw, its rootlessness and remoteness from the masses, was bound to reassert itself. At some point, the incompatibility of the mass social forces and the liberal goals would emerge, and shift leftwards would become uneven with the liberals lagging behind, no longer able to swallow the implications of what was an essentially non-bourgeois movement. Thus, the, quote, shift is not without limit, end quote. For the liberal movement, quote, there does exist a certain limit which is basically determined by its class nature, end quote. Outflanked both ideologically and politically by a mass movement beyond its capacity to control, liberalism will find itself, quote, hopelessly dragging behind, end quote. Footnote. It's something in Russian, but it says, see also something in Russian, where Trotsky warned the liberals that they could not possibly keep pace with the masses nor confine the masses to their own constitutional limits. End footnote. The intransigence of the autocracy may, in Trotsky's view, conceivably convince the intelligentsia, perhaps even other elements in the liberal movement, that the political structure could be changed only by revolution. However, on its own, liberalism could not make this revolution, and with the masses it could not make its revolution. The upshot of this will be that, compelled to choose between the radicalism of the masses and some kind of peaceful reformist accommodation with the autocracy, it will, even if unenthusiastically, submit to the second alternative. Thus it will be drawn back into the fold of its supposed adversary, contenting itself with the semblance of reform in the guise of fictional democratic institutions. Footnote. Trotsky made this, quote, prediction, end quote, in almost all of his writings composed during the events of 1905. End footnote. This prognosis of the future prospects and behavior of liberalism was made by Trotsky already in the first months of 1905. Immediately following the events of that year, and indeed throughout the decade or so which spread it from the next Russian Revolution, Trotsky, enrolling the, quote, lessons of the great year, end quote, saw this prognosis as having been confirmed. Thus, on the 12th anniversary of January 9th, looking back upon the behavior of the liberals in 1905, Trotsky summarized it thus, quote, during the first period of the revolution, the activities of the proletariat were met with sympathy, even with support from liberal society. The Miliukovs hoped the proletariat would strike a blow at absolutism and make it more inclined to compromise with the bourgeoisie. Yet absolutism, for centuries the exclusive ruler of the people, was in no hurry to share absolutism's power with the liberal parties. In October 1905, the bourgeoisie learnt that the bourgeoisie could not obtain power before the backbone of Tsarism was broken. The blessed goal could, apparently, be accomplished only by a victorious revolution. But the revolution put the working class in the foreground. It united the working class and solidified the working class, not only in the working class's struggle against Tsarism, but in the working class's struggle against capital as well. The consequence was that each new revolutionary step of the proletariat, in October, November, and December, the time of the Soviet, moved the liberals more and more in the direction of the monarchy. The hopes for revolutionary cooperation between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat turned out to be a forlorn utopia. End quote. Trotsky. Similarly, in Trotsky's very first stock-taking during 1906 and 1907, particularly in the book 1905, Trotsky felt his analysis to have been confirmed. Footnote. It should be stressed, however, that Trotsky did not ascribe the failure of the revolution to the, quote, betrayal, end quote, of liberalism. Since in Trotsky's view the events of 1905 did not depend on the liberals, the latter could be blamed only in part. More serious was the political unpreparedness of the workers. Trotsky's post-mortem is dealt with later in this chapter. End footnote. Trotsky pointed out how qualified and tentative had been the support of industrial capital for the liberal movement. It was, it is true, attracted by the prospect of a, quote, strict and legal public order, end quote, which liberalism promised. But it needed, quote, even more a centralized government, that great giver of the good things of life, end quote. Trotsky. And when it perceived the actual nature of mass agitation, particularly amongst its own workers, it quickly retreated to its protector, the Tsar, thus leaving once again the intelligentsia suspended without any socio-economic backing. Not only heavy industry reneged, manufacturing interests also eventually closed ranks with the authorities. Thus, the Moscow textile industry, for instance, more independent of the state and interested in strengthening the purchasing power of consumers, at first joined vigorously the opposition and, quote, viewed the rising storm with undoubted benevolence, end quote. Quote, but when the revolution revealed its social content and made the textile workers follow the course of the metal workers, the Moscow Council returned all the more determinedly and, quote, ideologically, end quote, to the side of strong government, and counter-revolutionary capital, after joining counter-revolutionary landlordism, found its leader in the Moscow merchant, Guchkov, the majority leader in the Third Duma. End quote. Trotsky. Let's see if there's a Guchkov. Wikipedia says Alexander Guchkov lived from 1862 to 1936 and was a Russian politician, chairman of the Third Duma and Minister of War in the Russian Provisional Government. Back to the text. Knei-Paz speaking. As for the liberal movement itself, with all the liberal movement's contradictions and weaknesses were merely put under one roof when in 1905, the Zemstvo, I'll figure out how to say that, eventually, constitutionalists and the Union of Liberation joined to form the Constitutional Democratic Party, Cadets. Quote, the party was, in its origin, a union of the powerless Zemstvo men with the generally weak intellectuals holding professional diplomas. The superficial character of the Zemstvo liberalism manifested itself clearly at the end of 1905, when the landlords, under the influence of agrarian disorders, quickly made their peace with the old order, and the liberal intelligentsia had to make a tearful departure from the manor house, where it had been, strictly speaking, only an adopted child, and look for recognition towards its historical family home, the city. But what company did it find in the city? A conservative big capital, a revolutionary proletariat, and an unbridgeable antagonism between conservative big capital and the revolutionary proletariat. End quote. Trotsky. It is this antagonism which, in Trotsky's view, was to spell the doom of liberalism in Russia, and with liberalism, of the bourgeois revolution. No such antagonism existed in the West when their liberalism arose and triumphed, because in the West, at the time, no revolutionary proletariat existed. No liberal movement could cope with it, certainly not the Russian liberal movement. Quote, and as to the hopelessly belated bourgeois intelligentsia born to the sound of socialist curses, is suspended over the abyss of class contradictions, inured by the traditions of landlordism, and wrapped in professional prejudices, without initiative, without influence over the masses, and without faith in tomorrow. End quote. Trotsky. To Trotsky, the events of 1905 had made it clear that the liberal movement lacked the capacity to bring about a bourgeois revolution. The behavior of other social forces, which in 1905 for the first time emerged as political forces, cast doubt, in his view, on the very idea of a bourgeois revolution in Russia. B. New section. The peasantry and agrarian reform. Until 1905, the peasants of Russia had been, for all intents and purposes, a dormant force. The subject more of romantic dreams than actual political activity, they had seen the hopes of 1861 frustrated by more than 40 years of governmental intransigence towards their basic needs. But this had not resulted in any political activity on a mass scale, nor made it much easier for those who championed their cause to organize their discontent into a genuine peasant movement. Even in 1905, no organization could claim to have captured the peasants' following, much less the peasants' unqualified and disciplined loyalty. But in 1905, for the first time, the peasants came to play a political role. Both in number and in scope, the peasants' revolts against landlords and against agrarian policy in general increased. Still spontaneous rather than forethought, still uncoordinated rather than organized, these revolts were nevertheless an important part of the revolution, and a serious blow to the autocracy's confidence in its traditional social bulwark. During 1905, the Party of Socialist Revolutionaries, SRs, founded less than 5 years earlier as an amalgam of various former populist groups, became a major force capitalizing on, though without really instigating, peasant revolts. An all-Russian peasant union, with organizations at local levels, was set up during the same year, and for a while was effective in organizing peasant opposition. In 1905, therefore, it became clear that the peasants had finally emerged as a political force. Henceforth, it would be impossible to contemplate political action without taking the peasantry into account, as a direct participant, certainly as an indispensable ally. Footnote. On the history of the Russian peasantry and the agrarian relations, see in particular Jerome Blum, Lord and Peasant in Russia from the 9th to the 19th Century, published in 1961, and G.T. Robinson's Rural Russia Under the Old Regime, 1932. On the peasant movement after 1905, see L.A. Owen, The Russian Peasant Movement, 1906 to 1917, published in 1937. End footnote. But had their political baptism of 1905 led to the creation of an independent force, capable of swamping the rest of the revolutionary movement in accordance with the actual social distribution of the population? Had the power of the peasants become proportional to their numbers, And moreover, were they a homogeneous body with clearly defined goals and aspirations? What were, in fact, the social content and political implications of the peasants' revolts? Did their conception of the future, if such a conception could be said to exist at all, extend beyond the simple alleviation of general grievances and iniquities? Finally, how dependable would they be in the midst of the chaos of political warfare, and how controllable by political leadership? In the wake of 1905, these questions became uppermost in the minds of the revolutionary parties and leaders, not least within the Marxist movement itself. Whatever his protestations in later years, there is little doubt that Trotsky's attitude towards the peasants in 1905 and subsequently was fundamentally different from that of Lenin. Footnote: Lenin's attitude towards the peasants is best seen in the previously mentioned two tactics of social democracy in the democratic revolution. Trotsky himself never wrote a work dealing specifically with the peasantry, and his views on this subject are dispersed in various writings. End footnote. This does not mean that he underestimated the importance of the peasant question. On the contrary, the agrarian problem in general and the plight of the individual peasant in particular represented for him the single major crisis in Russian society, the most intractable of its dilemmas, the most malignant of its afflictions. It reflected as much the revolutionary potential of Russia as her backwardness. In fact, had the agrarian problem been on the way to resolution, the whole character of the Russian revolutionary movement would have been different. Nor did Trotsky doubt the revolutionary character of the 1905 peasant stirrings. Trotsky agreed that the land question could be solved only by revolutionary means and that the peasants would eventually solve it. Trotsky even praised the role of the Peasant Union in the events of 1905 as having been responsible for the general alarm, which struck the government and nobility toward the end of the year. However, Trotsky's view of the peasantry was always colored by a fundamental pessimism about its objective capacities. Everywhere in the actual manifestation of these in Russia, in Results and Prospects, surveying the general history of the peasantry's role in European politics, Trotsky wrote, quote, "Shackled for centuries, poverty-ridden and furious, suffering at once all the elements of the old exploitation and the new, the peasantry at a certain moment constituted a vast reservoir of revolutionary strength, but unorganized, scattered, isolated from the towns, the nerve centers of politics and culture. Ignorant, limited in their horizons to the confines of their respective villages, indifferent to all that the town was thinking, the peasants could not play any role as a leading force." End quote. Trotsky. Footnote: Something in Russian is, together with 1905, the most important of Trotsky's early writings and the main source for his theory of the permanent revolution. It first appeared in 1906 in the above collection, and all subsequent references are to this edition. For the English translation, see Results and Prospects in Leon Trotsky, Permanent Revolution, and Results and Prospects, published in London, 1962. End footnote. The epithets, quote, primitive, quote, stupid, quote, backward, appear frequently when Trotsky describes the peasants. Quote, if it is true, end quote, Trotsky writes at one point in 1905, quote, that in general it is not political ideology which determines the development of class struggle. It is 3 times more true with regard to peasants, end quote. Trotsky. Footnote. In the 1930s, Trotsky made the following comment on the peasantry, quote, civilization has made the peasantry its pack animal. The bourgeoisie is, in the long run, only changed the form of the pack. Barely tolerated on the threshold of the national life, the peasant stands essentially outside the threshold of science. The historian is ordinarily as little interested in the peasant as the dramatic critic is in those gray figures who shift the scenery, carrying the heavens and earth on their backs, and scrub the dressing rooms of the actors, end quote. Trotsky, The History of the Russian Revolution, translated by Max Eastman. Eastman's translation is so meticulous and was lauded by Trotsky himself. See his postscript at the end of the introduction to volumes 2 and 3 of The History of the Russian Revolution. that there seems to be no reason not to utilize it throughout. All subsequent references are to the London 1965 edition. Citations, however, have been checked with the Russian original. End footnote. Trotsky was always repelled by the peasants' low level of culture, the peasants' moribund provincialism, and the peasants' inability to give articulate expression to the cruel conditions of the peasants' environment. It may be that Trotsky feared above all that should the numerical superiority of the peasants get a hold of the revolutionary movement, that movement would cut Russia off all that was progressive and enlightening in civilized life. Footnote. Trotsky, however, could write with sensitivity about the hardships of the Russian peasant. End footnote. Nevertheless, he did not really believe that the peasants, whatever their numbers, could come to dominate what he saw as the emerging pattern of mass opposition to the Tsarist regime. He did not see in them any capacity for political tenacity so essential to political leadership. They were capable of spontaneous, not organized rebellion, of impulsive actions, not carefully thought out blows, of acts of desperation, not disciplined political gambits. The following passage from 1905 best sums up Trotsky's estimate of peasant revolutionism. Quote, "The knot of Russian social and political barbarism is tied in the village, but this does not mean that the village has brought forth a class capable of cutting it. The peasantry scattered among 50,000 settlements over the 5 million square versts of European Russia has not acquired from its past any tradition of united struggle. Until the agrarian disorders of 1905-6, the task of the rebellious peasants was limited to expelling the landlords from their village, their volost, or their uyezd, UYEZD. The landowning nobility could mobilize the centralized machinery of government against a peasant revolution. The peasantry could overcome it only by a simultaneous and resolute countrywide rising. But the living conditions of the peasant made them incapable of such a rising. A cretinous localism has been the historical curse of peasant risings, from which peasant risings can free themselves only insofar as they cease being purely peasant risings and merge with the revolutionary movements of new social classes." End quote. The peasants, therefore, were not and could not be an independent political, much less revolutionary force. Historically, according to Trotsky, this had been true everywhere, and Russia provided yet a further and certainly more stark confirmation of what European experience had already taught. The collapse of feudalism in Europe was first of all the work of the European bourgeoisie. Its struggle against absolutism depended on the breakup of traditional land relations, which were the basis of its adversaries' political and social power. The peasant joined the struggle against the state only after the bourgeoisie had already undermined the stability of the countryside. In the process, he became the ally of the bourgeoisie, but always in the role of a junior partner, seldom aware of the larger implications of the transformation in which he had become involved. At no time was there any possibility of this alliance being turned upside down. In fact, the whole history of the growth of capitalism was, quote, "the history of the subordination of the country to the town," end quote. Trotsky. The development of industry shifted power away from the countryside, where power had resided in the landed nobility, to the cities, where power came to reside in the hands of self-made capital. Self-made capital then came to govern both economic production and agriculture and the new social relations, based on private property, which henceforth characterized the countryside. In this way, the bourgeois aspirations of the peasant were fulfilled through the prerequisites of commerce and industrialism. Footnote. Trotsky attributed the failures of the revolutions of 1848 to the fact that the bourgeoisie at the time was unwilling to stand at the head of the peasant movements. End footnote. But on its own, the countryside could never have, quote, "produced a class which could undertake the revolutionary task of abolishing feudalism," end quote. And if this was true in Europe, how much truer was it in Russia? Quote, we have enormous masses of rural revolutionaries. The peasants can constitute a prodigious force in the service of the revolution, but it would be unworthy, to think that the party of the muzhiks is capable of taking the lead, muzhiks being peasants, and of liberating on its own initiative the productive forces of the nation, is the town which possesses hegemony in modern society, end quote. Trotsky. If the development of Russia were analogous to that of Europe, the Russian bourgeoisie should now do for the Russian peasant what its counterpart did for the European for the European peasant. But in Trotsky's view, Russian development was not analogous, but the Russian bourgeoisie was not even capable of struggling for its own interests and needs, much less those of another social class. Quote, where, end quote, Trotsky asked, quote, is that urban democracy which should drag after itself the whole nation, end quote. In fact, it is nowhere to be found. Embedded in its landowning origins and influences, severed from the state-created industrial elite, permeated by professional idealism, it was as far removed from national political leadership as the peasantry itself. Thus, its attitude toward land reform, the precondition of the solution to the agrarian problem, was at best ambivalent, at times passive, at worst even one of opposition. It believed on the whole that the problem could be settled through legislative means, peacefully, gradually, without unduly and traumatically endangering the position of the landowning nobility. However, this nobility was not prepared to commit, quote, class suicide, end quote. It would fight, quote, as ferociously as any ruling class engaged in a life-and-death struggle, end quote, to protect its, quote, soil, end quote. Quote, the land question cannot be solved by a parliamentary agreement with the nobility, but only by the revolutionary pressure of the masses, end quote. Yet the peasant masses themselves remained unreliable. Torn between their new hunger for land and their age-old servility, they wavered between spontaneous rebellion and traditional obedience. The low level of ideological development prevented them deriving political conclusions from social conditions. They were at once the Tsar's most implacable enemies and his most loyal servants. Thus left to themselves, they would engage in contradictory and self-defeating activities. Quote, the first wave of the Russian Revolution of 1905 was broken by the political stupidity of the peasant who first fought the landlord of his village to take over his land and then put on the soldier's uniform and shot at workers. We may view the events of this revolution as a series of pitiless object lessons by which history knocks into the head of the peasant the awareness of the links which exist between his local need for land and the central problem of political power, end quote. Trotsky. The failures of the peasants in 1905 were to be attributed to its social immaturity, cultural backwardness, and political inexperience. The failure, however, did not represent the, quote, end of the road, end quote, for peasant revolutionism. On the contrary, 1905, according to Trotsky, marked the very beginning of peasant opposition, the continuation of which, though it might be delayed and diverted temporarily, would in the long run inevitably follow, since agrarian reform would remain the central problem of Russian society. Such reform was fundamentally impossible without the transformation of the whole social and political structure of Russia. Sooner or later, the peasant would sense this to be so, would grasp instinctively that his own aspirations were dependent on this transformation. On his own, however, he could not undertake this task, because of his natural isolation from the centers of political and economic power and the narrowness of his vision. As always, therefore, he would need leadership rejected by the bourgeoisie. He would seek it elsewhere. He would find it when he perceived his own interest to have become bound up with the objectives of another social class. That movement would gain his loyalty, which was most prepared to recognize the legitimacy of his claims as a precondition for him. As a precondition for its own. Quote, in a revolution, the only party that can win the support of the peasantry is the party that leads the most revolutionary masses of the city, and that does not hesitate to assault feudal property because it is not afraid of the property-owning bourgeoisie. Only the social democracy is such a party today, end quote. Trotsky. New section, C. The proletariat and social democracy. However unprecedented the spread of peasant rebellion in 1905, could not have come as a complete surprise. After all, no one, whatever his political loyalties, could deny the condition of the majority of peasants had, during the decades of industrialization, degenerated to the point of mass destitution. Moreover, it was widely recognized that the peasantry always represented a potential force which could, in one way or another, undermine the fragile base upon which the legitimacy of the Tsarist regime rested. Its numbers alone assured it of destructive power, if not the power to provide an alternative regime of its own. Certainly, much more surprising must have been the emergence of the workers as a political force, even more so than for the peasants. 1905 was for them the first real test of strength, a baptismal plunge into the chaos of Russian politics. Unlike the peasants, they were small in numbers, in relative terms an almost insignificant proportion of the population. Although highly concentrated, they were forbidden to form unions and thus lacked any organizational tradition. Ideology and movements which appealed to their support were abundant, but their access to the workers was limited. Many workers remained tied to the village. All were probably uncertain of their social position vis-a-vis the countryside, so that the conception of class solidarity and class consciousness must have been of the most rudimentary nature. Finally, their economic condition was not uniform. It depended on the industry in which they were employed or on the region in which they lived. Many were indeed destitute, but others were certainly better off than most peasants. Yet there can be little doubt that during 1905 the same workers revealed a capacity for concerted action, which went beyond anything that the peasants could muster. It is true, of course, that in the end they suffered defeat no less than others, but they proved more capable of translating economic power into political pressure than any other group. Trotsky was certainly right when he attributed this success to the fact that in Russia, as elsewhere, the creation of industry had the effect of introducing into society an element of economic vulnerability, which was almost inconceivable within a purely agricultural economy. An industrial economy, in contrast to the latter, was a national economy, and when, as in Russia, the state itself was its begetter and overlord, the very existence of the state became dependent on the proper functioning of industry. It is in this sense that economics, when industrialized, are also politicized, and power becomes in great part subject to industrial effectiveness. This general distinction between agricultural and industrial economies was the starting point for Trotsky's analysis of the political effectiveness of the proletariat. Of course, this was hardly an original idea. It was not even the exclusive insight of Marxism. Obviously, it is almost a banality that workers as a group constitute a unique source of political power as a result of their strategic economic functions. The point, however, is not the originality of the idea, but the extent of its relevance to Russia. No one had really assumed that the Russian proletariat had by 1905 acquired an economic position even analogous to its counterpart in the West, nor did anyone really assume that it could acquire such a position without there first being large-scale capitalist development, which would see the rise initially of the bourgeoisie and only thereafter of the working class. Finally, no one had assumed that the workers could be a political... Finally, no one had assumed that the workers could be a political force while their numbers were still so limited. When, as Lenin argued in 1905, they still constituted a small minority of the population. Trotsky's originality lay precisely in the making of all these assumptions. Together they would form one of the basic foundations of his theory of a Russian revolution. But Trotsky also pointed to the very events of 1905 as sufficient empirical proof for the specific political strength and maturity of the Russian workers. Trotsky's account of the workers' participation in 1905 emphasized its many faceted forms. the spontaneous mass demonstration, the economic strike, the establishment of a rival political authority. From the tragic procession of the 9th of January to the collapse of the St. Petersburg Soviet on the 3rd of December, the workers had traveled a long road which, however, had ended in defeat. Nevertheless, in Trotsky's view, in the process, they had shed their, quote, political infancy, end quote, established their superiority within the opposition camps, and had made it clear that without their leadership, no revolution in Russia was now conceivable. The whole drama of 1905 had opened with a workers' demonstration, but it had been spontaneous in nature, outside the framework of party organizations, and led by the improbable figure of Father Gapon. Quote, in perplexing manner, placed by history at the head of the working masses for several days, end quote. There's two footnotes here, one that I missed earlier and one that is relevant now. The one I missed says, all the foregoing will be discussed in detail in chapters 3 and 4 below. Here only Trotsky's evaluation of the political activities of the workers in 1905 is dealt with. And then the next footnote says, some article in Russian. This article, written between the 20th of January and the 2nd of February 1905, while Trotsky was in Geneva, was his first reaction to the events of the 9th of January. It was composed as a separate piece, but was later published in the above collection as the concluding chapter of, I think it's before, until the 9th of January. Was the title earlier? I don't know, it's in Russian. Anyway, end footnotes. Trotsky paid tribute to Gapon, whose memory, he said, quote, will always be dear to the revolutionary proletariat, end quote, for having, quote, opened the sluices of the revolutionary torrent, end quote. I think Father Gapon turned out to be a spy, or like a police agent. Yet he could remain at the head of this torrent only briefly. Having helped to unleash it, Gapon was himself overwhelmed by it, unprepared for the actual forces the movement expressed. A second Gapon would, quote, now look ridiculous, end quote, since the spontaneous upheaval would now search for an organized framework, a plan of action, and a clearly formulated revolutionary ideology. Whatever followed now, however, the spontaneity of the opening act was unavoidable in its form. Only in this way was it possible to establish once and for all the revolutionary potential of the masses, quote, no longer a theory but a fact, end quote. Scoffing at the words of Struve, who had only 2 days before the Petersburg procession had written that, quote, there are no revolutionary people in Russia as yet, end quote, Trotsky replied, quote, the proletariat of Petersburg manifested, political alertness and revolutionary energy, The revolutionary proletariat of Petersburg is no romanticism. It is a living reality. So is the proletariat of other cities. An enormous wave is rolling over Russia. It is not yet quieted down, The proletariat has risen, end quote. Trotsky. For Trotsky, the events of January 1905 marked the beginning of a revolutionary uprising, but the spontaneity of the masses, quote, enough to start with, end quote, was, quote, not enough to win, end quote. Win. Everything now depended on the extent to which an organized movement, representing the working masses, succeeded in mobilizing these masses through planned unified action. There were two dangers. The one, that the fervor of the masses would outrun the preparedness of the movement. The other, that this fervor would degenerate into local, uncoordinated, and scattered outbursts consuming, quote, precarious revolutionary energy with no results, end quote. It was the task of the workers' movement, therefore, to keep pace with the masses themselves and to provide the masses with that institutional framework which could turn isolated local risings into a, quote, national uprising, end quote. Quote, no local demonstration has a serious political significance any longer. After the Petersburg uprising, only an all-Russian uprising should take place. Whatever spontaneous outbursts occurred. They must be made use of to revolutionize and to solidify the masses, to popularize among them the idea of an all-Russian uprising. That was in italics, so I'll repeat it. They must be made use of to revolutionize and to solidify the masses, to popularize among the masses the idea of an all-Russian uprising. End quote. Trotsky. This is the role which Trotsky now called upon the Social Democratic Party to perform. It was the only party which could claim to be both revolutionary and integrally connected to the working masses. It was the only party which had both the necessary organizational facilities and a revolutionary theory, hence both political technique and slogans, quote, political ideas, end quote. The organization of a national uprising, which in Trotsky's view would determine the, quote, fate of the entire revolution, end quote, needed now to be the primary objective of the Social Democrats. Footnote. Never mind, no footnote. In fact, of course, Trotsky, writing these lines at the beginning of 1905, had overestimated the capacity of the social democratic movement. It was as unprepared in 1905 to provide political leadership as were other movements. It too was overwhelmed by events and overtaken by their sheer spontaneity. It was in any case split, with one faction, the Mensheviks, looking upon the events of 1905 as mainly a struggle of the bourgeoisie, and the second faction, the Bolsheviks, although in principle far more committed to direct action, almost completely left out of events and in any case also unprepared for the scope of the workers' agitation. Footnote. C. Schwartz, The Russian Revolution of 1905. End footnote. Trotsky was almost alone in his belief in a national uprising led by the workers. Footnote. See again Trotsky's speech to the Tsarist court, published in 1905, in the book 1905. And footnote. Later he would attribute part of the failure of the workers in 1905 to this unpreparedness of the social democratic movement, the danger of which Parvis had been the first to warn, that the workers would run ahead of the party, seemed to Trotsky to have materialized. The autonomous movement of political activity among the workers is one of the recurring and central themes in Trotsky's writings after 1905. In the unfolding of events, Trotsky saw the workers as receiving and assimilating a political education. The spontaneous beginnings of January had turned into the organized strikes of October and November. Here Trotsky believed were the real indications of how far the workers had grasped the source of their economic strength and how far the workers had learned to translate their strength into political action. Already in 1904, Trotsky had predicted that the general strike would become the major weapon in the hands of the workers. Trotsky had then argued that spontaneous outbursts would be to no avail unless they were followed by united action which struck a blow at the economic underpinnings of the regime and which ultimately attracted to its side the peasant population. Trotsky had made it clear that while the workers alone could immobilize the economy for a limited period, they could not hope to triumph in a decisive confrontation with the government without the support of the peasants. What actually happened in October and November 1905 confirmed in his view both aspects of this forecast. Footnote. Trotsky discussed the strikes of October and November in the book 1905. End footnote. Back to the text. What actually happened in October and November 1905 confirmed in Trotsky's view both aspects of this forecast. On the one hand, the strikes virtually brought Russia to a standstill, railways, factories, mines ground to a halt. As the strike wave spread, the regime began to totter and for the first time to submit to its opponents' demands. On October 17th/30th, with the general strike showing no signs of abating, the Tsar took fright and issued a manifesto promising civil liberties, constitutional government, and an extension of the franchise to those groups which had hitherto been completely excluded from voting rights. Although these promises fell short of a commitment to a constituent assembly, they represented a major concession on the part of the autocracy and a major victory for the workers. To Trotsky, the general strike proved once and for all the political superiority of town over countryside and the proletariat over all other classes opposed to the regime. Quote, the October strike was a demonstration of the hegemony of the proletariat in the bourgeois revolution, and at the same time of the hegemony of the city over the countryside. It is in vain that the reaction seeks to evaluate the proportional importance of the urban population and consoles itself by dreaming that Russia is still a nation of peasants. The political role in the modern city, like its economic role, cannot be measured by the simple numbers of its inhabitants. The retreat of the reaction before the strikes of the cities, in spite of the silence of the countryside, is the best proof that can be given of the dictatorship exercised by the city. End quote, Trotsky in the book 1905. In this sense, Trotsky saw the strikes as a success, as having conclusively established the central role of the workers in Russian politics. While these same workers were responsible for bringing matters to a head, the workers' struggle simultaneously demonstrated the workers, too, could not carry out an actual insurrection on their own, for they were dependent on the support of the peasants, and the peasants, donning their army uniforms, remained loyal to the government. Hence, at the crucial moment, the unarmed workers were barred by the bayonets of the peasants from turning the strike into an insurrection. Had they won over the peasants, they would have won over the army, and in that case the collapse of the regime would have been inevitable. In the event, however, the general strike, having exhausted its tasks without arms, had to withdraw when faced by arms. Footnote 1905, the book. Trotsky himself, as leader of the Soviet, had warned against a direct confrontation with the full force of the Tsar's army, and Trotsky had urged the cancellation of the strikes when they reached a point at which the danger of such a confrontation seemed imminent. See Deutscher, The Prophet Armed. End footnote. This was also to be the fate of the St. Petersburg Soviet. Like the demonstrations and the strikes, the Soviet was not the creation of the social democratic movement. It grew largely spontaneously and without earlier preparation. From within various workers' groups, at first representatives of the printing shops, later of other trades as well, including the metal and textile industries. Eventually, its membership exceeded 500 delegates. Neither the Bolsheviks, who had from the start given it a cool reception, nor the Mensheviks, who were far more enthusiastic and involved in it, controlled its affairs. Together, they had only 6 delegates in an executive committee of 31. Footnote. See Hugh Seton Watson, The Russian Empire, 1801 to 1917. End footnote. The Soviet was established in the middle of October, and during the next 6 weeks, the Soviet became a kind of focus of revolutionary activity, the body most responsible for directing and organizing the mass of workers. The Soviet's most dramatic figure throughout, even before its final days when he became its formal head, was Trotsky himself. Footnote. Trotsky's account of the Soviet is in 1905, the book. If the general strikes had shown the scope of the workers' disruptive powers, the Soviet, according to Trotsky, demonstrated their capacity for innovating institutional alternatives. Despite the lack of planning, the Soviet, Trotsky claimed, functioned efficiently and never strayed beyond the possibilities of its limits. But within these limits, it exercised full authority without undermining its character as a representative organ. The Soviet, Trotsky wrote, was not established to create a workers' movement, much less an insurrection, but grew out of the movement itself, testifying to the fact that an organization is not necessary to initiate working-class activity, but is essential only at a later stage to guide and coordinate such activity. Footnote. This part of the book 1905 was originally written in a somewhat different form as a chapter of the book, something in Russian, published in St. Petersburg in 1906, which Trotsky edited. It appears there under the title something in Russian. Besides this, in the introduction to the book, Trotsky contributed another chapter, which was also included later in 1905. The rest of the book, however, is by other participants in the Soviet. Oh, there's another footnote. See, for example, Trotsky's comment in Something in Russian, where Trotsky attributed the creation of Soviets in general to the, quote, masses themselves, end quote. This theme runs throughout the book 1905. Trotsky's view of the Soviet as an instrument of revolution will be dealt with in Chapter 5 below, in the context of Trotsky's position on the issue of revolutionary organization and tactics. End footnote. The Soviet was created because the workers needed an organization. This does not mean that the Soviet as such was to be subject to the moods and whims of the masses. On the contrary, the Soviet's task, according to Trotsky, was to control the mass temperament, to lead the masses, and perhaps above all, to act as a check on the masses' impulsiveness. The Soviet's very creation, Trotsky believed, bore witness to the advanced character of the workers' movement in Russia. Soviets sprung up elsewhere as well, in Moscow, Odessa, and other cities. But the St. Petersburg Soviet was the, quote, model, end quote, for all of them, the, quote, most important workers' organization which Russia has known to this day, end quote. Trotsky, the book, 1905. The workers, by creating this organization, had shown that they were, quote, capable of creating authoritative power, end quote. But this power was unlike anything which had hitherto existed in Russia. Quote, the Soviet is the first democratic power in modern Russian history. The Soviet is the organized power of the masses themselves over the masses' component parts. It is a true unadulterated democracy, ... Through its members, through deputies elected by the working men, the Soviet directs the social activities of the proletariat as a whole and its various parts, ... end quote. Trotsky. 1905. It is clear, therefore, that for Trotsky the most important revelation of 1905, embodied in the St. Petersburg Soviet, was the extent to which Russian workers were capable of creating new and advanced institutions. The Soviet was not only unique by Russian standards, it was almost unique by Western standards, too. Footnote, the precedent for it in the West was, according to Trotsky, the Paris Commune. See the preface Trotsky wrote in December 1905 under the title Something in Russian, 1871 to 1906, to a Russian edition of Marx's The Paris Commune, published as Karl Marx, Something in Russian, St. Petersburg, 1906. End footnote. This did not contradict the social reality of Russia. Rather, for Trotsky, it reflected the true distribution of economic and political powers in a society as topsy-turvy as Russia had become. Nevertheless, in 1905, the Soviet, in spite of the wide support it had received from the workers, could not sustain itself, any more than the general strikes it directed could lead to a political collapse of the autocracy. At a certain stage, Trotsky believed the task of the Soviet should have become the arming of the workers. But this it could not do, so long as it had no access to the army through the peasants. And although it sought to give representation to peasant groups, the socialist revolutionaries were among its ranks. The peasant masses as a whole either remained indifferent or pursued their opposition independently. The results were that the Soviet could not risk unleashing the full force of the workers' opposition, that it spent much of its time walking the thin line between opposition based on various forms of demonstrations and revolutionary offensive, and that in the end it surrendered rather than face a violent confrontation with the stronger forces ranged against it. Quote, all the oppressed, all the unfortunate, all honest elements of the city, all those who were striving towards a better life were instinctively or consciously on the side of the Soviet. ... The Soviet was actually or potentially a representative of an overwhelming majority of the population. The Soviet's enemies in the capital would not have been dangerous had they not been protected by absolutism. which based its powers on the most backward elements of an army recruited from peasants. The weakness of the Soviet was not its own weakness. It was the weakness of a purely urban revolution, end quote. Trotsky. From the book 1905. And it was in view of all this, and what in view of all this were the conclusions to be drawn about the Social Democratic Party. At the beginning of 1905, Trotsky had urged the party to stand at the head of the workers, to become the workers' spokesman and organizational arm, even to act as coordinator of a national uprising. But with the birth of the Soviet, Trotsky became convinced that these tasks were beyond the capacity of the party and more naturally belonged to the Soviet. In fact, the very creation of the Soviet signified to Trotsky that the party had failed to fill the organizational vacuum. It was split both institutionally and ideologically. It was neither structured nor organized in a way which could accommodate the emerging pattern of the workers' direct involvement in politics. From the very outset, Trotsky argued that the Soviet should be as representative a body as possible, a united front for all workers of whatever political affiliation, unencumbered by factional squabbles. Only in this way could it hope both to gain wide support and to exploit to the full the strength of the numbers. The emergence of the Soviet as the fulcrum of the workers' activities demonstrated to Trotsky the fundamental differences of organization and tasks between this new phenomenon and the party. In a passage in 1905, remarkable for its anti-party sentiments, Trotsky summarized these differences, quote, "The Social Democratic Party, which within its clandestine confines narrowly united several hundred, and through the circulation of ideas several thousand workers in Petersburg, was in a position to give the masses slogans which would clarify their natural experience in the flashing light of political thought. But this party was not capable of uniting through a living bond in a single organization the thousands and thousands of men whom the masses composed. In effect, it always carried out its essential work in secret laboratories, in the dens of conspiracy which the masses ignored, ... The difficulties on the one hand which existed between the two equally strong factions of social democracy and their struggles on the other, with the socialist revolutionaries, made absolutely indispensable the creation of an impartial organization. To have the authority of the masses on the very morrow of its formation, it had to be instituted on the basis of a very wide representation," end quote. Trotsky. Elsewhere in 1905, the book, Trotsky added, quote, ... The Soviet was in reality the embryo of a revolutionary government, ... Prior to the Soviet, there had been many revolutionary organizations among the industrial workers, mostly social democratic ones, but these were organizations within the proletariat. Their immediate aim was to struggle for influence over the masses. The Soviet became immediately the organization of the proletariat. Its aim was to struggle for revolutionary power. End quote. Trotsky. 1905. We shall in a later chapter return in greater detail to Trotsky's views on party organization at this and other times. Footnote, see chapter 5 below where Trotsky's views on the Soviet are also discussed again. In the meantime, however, we must conclude that in the light of his experience of 1905, Trotsky had become convinced that the Social Democratic Party, whether for reasons of the Social Democratic Party's specific problems in 1905 or the Social Democratic Party's intrinsic structure, could not command the political or organizational loyalty of the working class population. In effect, he claimed it was being outstripped by events. The workers themselves had proved more militant than the party had apparently expected, while its structure remained geared more to pre-revolutionary agitation than to revolutionary leadership. Henceforth, not the party, but those organizations created by the workers themselves in the very midst of revolutionary activity would control the fate of the revolution itself. Once again, this was for Trotsky a reflection of the unique and peculiar features Trotsky perceived in the development of Russian politics and society. Section 2. The emerging pattern of Russian politics. A quarter of a century after 1905, Trotsky would summarize the results of that year in the pithy sentence, quote, "Although with a few broken ribs, Tsarism came out of the experience of 1905 alive and strong enough," end quote. This had become obvious to him already by the end of 1905, for he did not take seriously the promises made by the government in the October Manifesto, and did not in any case attribute much importance to the scope of the concessions. Footnote. For Trotsky's evaluation of the October Manifesto, see his book 1905. Quote, "Everything has been given," end quote, Trotsky wrote, quote, "and nothing has been given," end quote. End footnote. If, therefore, at the outset of 1905, he had been unoptimistic about the prospects of revolution, and in the course of the year had even been carried away by the sight of the escalating mass disturbances, at the close of it and immediately thereafter, contemplating that, quote, experience, end quote, within the walls of the prison where he now sat, he could not but conclude that the revolution was hardly a revolution at all, and that it had at any rate ended in failure. This was true not only in the obvious sense that power had not been wrested away from the autocracy, not only in the sense that Russia's political structure remained fundamentally intact, but in the sense also that the revolutionary forces themselves had emerged routed and in disarray. The extent of defeat in this latter sense is not immediately obvious, became evident in the light of the exhaustion and overall decline of political activity among workers and peasants alike during subsequent years. For Trotsky, the reason for the failure of 1905 had little to do with the so-called cowardice or impotence of the liberals, except that this explained the impossibility of a bourgeois revolution. But the revolution was for him only ostensibly a liberal bourgeois affair. Fundamentally, the revolution had a mass character. The weakness, therefore, of the liberal movement was in this sense irrelevant. The more relevant problem was why the revolution of 1905, as a revolution of workers and peasants, had collapsed. There were, in Trotsky's view, two main reasons closely related. On the one hand, the continued political subservience of the peasant to the regime, which took the form of loyalty in the army. On the other, the instability of the workers to force an alliance with the peasant masses, so that the city remained isolated from the countryside. Footnote. The problem of winning over the army was discussed by Trotsky in his book 1905. End footnote. In the one case, the peasants, though now in opposition, when outside the army, in the end remained the autocracy's main bulwark. In the other, the workers, though now turning the city into the center of political activity, were yet unable to impose its emerging hegemony over the whole country. The one case showed, according to Trotsky, that the peasants had still not grasped the relationship between opposition and political power, between demands for social reform and the need to seize the reins of government. Thus, rebellion did not flow over into revolution. The second case was a reflection of the fact that while the workers could act in a revolutionary manner, did think in terms of power, they did not understand the importance of creating a wider social movement which would encompass all the masses. The upshot was the absence of a united front, with city and countryside acting largely independently of each other, and the consequent diffusion and dissipation of the potential power of the masses. Thus, 1905 ended as 1905 had begun, widespread opposition involving all sectors of Russian society, but no national uprising. Footnote. This is the central theme of Trotsky's, quote, summary, end quote, of the 1905 events in his book, 1905. Yet the failures of the revolution, according to Trotsky, had to be seen within the context and possibilities of 1905. They reflected temporary weaknesses, not constants which would remain forever barriers to effective action. In fact, Trotsky believed the revolution revealed how far the political character of the masses was changing, with the obvious implications of this for the future, which, in his view, could consequently only be a source of confidence to a social democrat. Aside from the fact that no society could undergo an upheaval of such proportion as 1905 without leaving a permanent impression on its collective consciousness, and that this in itself was therefore a factor which would play a role in the future, the revolution, in Trotsky's view, had made concrete the hitherto imperceptible emergence onto the Russian political scene of new realities. The myth of the peasants as an eternally docile, apolitical force had been laid to rest forever. Whatever their shortcomings, confusions, and immaturity in 1905, the peasants had proved not only their fundamental dissatisfaction with things as they were, but also their preparedness to give expression to their grievances. Henceforth, they could no longer be ruled out as a force to be reckoned with. However, the most significant development for the long run was the role and involvement of the workers, which, with unprecedented rapidity, with little or no previous experience of political activity of a non-clandestine nature, they had assumed in the course of 1905 the most radical and most determined posture. They had not only stolen the thunder of the liberals, they had in fact emerged as the revolutionary force in Russia. The liberals had shown themselves to be both non-revolutionary and irrelevant. The workers, it is true, would be like the workers, the peasants, it is true, would be like the workers, indispensable to any future assault on the autocracy. But unlike the workers, they would always lack the initiative and the capacity for either political or ideological leadership. A revolution in Russia would thus depend on workers and peasants alike, but it was the former who would constitute its moving and shaping force. Quote, neither the peasantry nor the middle class nor the intelligentsia, end quote, Trotsky had declared in March 1905, quote, can play an independent revolutionary role in any way equivalent to that of the proletariat, end quote. Trotsky. Nothing that happened in the course of the year changed his mind on this point, and he would continuously repeat it in subsequent years. We shall not pause at this stage to criticize Trotsky's conclusions, for the issues involved here, the actual strength of Russian workers, the viability of a workers' government in Russian conditions, the significance of the Soviet, the role of the peasants, and the supposed subservient function of party organization, are best considered in the light of his whole theory of the Russian Revolution, to which subsequent chapters of this study are devoted, and where the criticisms are raised. At this point in our exposition, in order to understand the sources of that theory, let us only summarize the main thesis which Trotsky attempted to draw from the events of 1905. This was that the revolution signified the emergence of a new pattern of politics in Russia, and one, moreover, which had no precedent in the European past. Its most prominent feature was the direct confrontation in a pre-bourgeois society between workers and government, between an industrial labor class and a traditional aristocracy, between socialist ideas and those of absolutism, and this at a time when the workers were a minority and the peasants still the overwhelming majority of the population. What else was this pattern of politics, Trotsky concluded, with all its apparent contradictions and possibilities, except the pattern characteristic of a backward society, or rather of a society backward in a peculiar manner? If politics, as Trotsky believed, were the visible expression of protuberance, Marx's, quote, superstructure, end quote, of social change and development, then the emerging pattern of Russian politics had to be grasped as a reflection of the hidden underside of Russian backwardness. To expose the latter and thereby also the full implication, the contradictions and possibilities of the pattern itself, it was necessary, Trotsky believed, to probe into social history. The end. Thanks for listening.